If I have to give up the company, everything I've built, I will. If it means I get to wake up next to you every morning, I'll let it all go. Those words weren't part of any contract. They weren't rehearsed or forced. They came from a man who once believed love was weakness, a man now standing in front of the only woman who ever made him feel truly alive. Julian Westmont, the ruthless CEO who had built an empire on logic, control, and silence, never expected to fall for Clara Bennett, a struggling writer with fire in her heart and scars she hid behind laughter. What began as a cold business arrangement to fool his powerful mother slowly unraveled into something far more dangerous. Love real, unpredictable, irreversible. But can love born from lies truly last? Or will it all come crashing down the moment the contract ends? Stay with us for a story filled with longing heartbreak, slow-burning passion, and a love that refuses to follow the rules. If this kind of story moves your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. In the towering skyline of Montclair City, there lived a man whose name alone could still a room, Julian Westmont. At just 32, Julian had built Westmore Group into a global powerhouse. With silver-streaked hair, a sharply tailored coat, and stormy gray eyes, he moved through life with the precision of a man who trusted no one. People said he had no weaknesses. That was almost true, except for one love, or rather his disbelief in it. Julian had witnessed love fall apart when he was too young to understand it. His father, Victor West, a cold magnate with a glittering smile and an empty heart, had left his mother for a life of champagne, and younger women, Eleanor Westmont, elegant and iron-willed, had raised Julian on her own, pouring ambition into his veins and turning heartbreak into fuel. But now, Evelyn wanted something in return. I built this empire with my own hands. Julian, I won't leave it to a man with no heart and no family. She had said, you will marry within 1 year, or I will dismantle your claim to Westmore brick by brick. It wasn't the threat that unsettled Julian. It was the timing. He had too much at stake to entertain emotion, and yet he needed to buy time. A solution came to him like any other business problem: hire the role, play the part, keep the company, a fake wife. Just for 1 year, miles away in a tiny neighborhood tucked beneath the city's chaos, lived a woman who had never heard the name Julian Westmont. Her name was Clara Monroe, 27 years old. Quiet eyes, coffee-colored curls, always tied with a pencil, and a soft voice that carried more strength than it seemed. Once a literature student with dreams of writing stories that healed the world, Clara had lost everything 4 years ago: her parents, their small bookstore, and the life she thought she was building. Grief, as it often does, came quietly and stayed too long. Now Clara worked the early shift at a humble cafe, pouring coffee for strangers, smiling on cue and scribbling story fragments in the corners of receipt paper. Her life was measured in rent, due dates, and silent prayers, until one frosty morning when the city decided to rewrite her story. The cafe was packed, humming with the usual blend of espresso steam and impatient customers. Clara was balancing 2 plates, dodging elbows, when the door swung open and the air shifted. He walked in like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Julian Westmont sharp suit, distant stare, and a silence that somehow spoke louder than the music overhead. Clara didn't know who he was, but something about him unsettled her. Maybe it was how out of place he looked, like a thunderstorm in a quiet garden. She served him black coffee, no sugar, no smile. He didn't thank her. But the next day, he came again, and the next. Until one evening, as she locked up and the streets glowed with golden lamplight, Julian stepped out of a parked car. "I have a proposal," he said calmly. She blinked. "We close at 7. I'm not here for coffee." That was how it began. A stranger, a contract, a promise that was never meant to feel like hope. But something told Clara Monroe that her life was about to change forever. The morning rush at Hazel and Thyme Cafe was relentless. Plates clattered, espresso steamed, and voices merged into a steady hum of city life. Moving swiftly between tables, Clara Monroe balanced trays like a seasoned juggler, her eyes scanning orders, while her thoughts drifted to unfinished stories in her notebook. When she reached the counter, her gaze landed on a sharply dressed man standing alone. His presence pulled at the air around him, tall, commanding, with a phone pressed to his ear and a scowl that could curdle milk. His charcoal gray coat fit perfectly over broad shoulders, and his jaw clenched slightly, as if he had just finished a conversation he deeply regretted. Clara offered a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. What can I get started for you?" He looked up. Their eyes met for a second too long. His were a piercing storm gray, unflinching and cool. There was something dangerous in the way he studied her. Not lecherous, not flirty, just analytical. Like he was evaluating her as if she were a piece of data in a very serious equation. "Black coffee. No sugar," he said flatly, his voice deep and crisp like the sound of gravel under polished shoes. She nodded and made the order quickly, hands moving out of habit, but not a minute had passed before she heard his voice again, taut with irritation. "What is this?" She turned to see him holding the coffee cup like it had personally offended him. "Your coffee," she said, arching a brow. "I said no sugar. There is no sugar." She folded her arms. "I made it myself. You're welcome to taste it." He met her gaze. Something flickered behind those cold eyes, amusement, skepticism, she couldn't tell. But he took a sip, then after a beat, he placed the cup down, and the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. "At least you know how to do your job." Clara rolled her eyes and walked away. Another self-important man with too much money and too little grace. She'd seen hundreds. She didn't care who he was, but he cared. Julian. Westmont had been on the verge of canceling this ridiculous fake marriage plan. He didn't have time for it, not really, but something about the woman behind the counter had stayed with him. She didn't flinch. She wasn't impressed, and most importantly, she wasn't trying to win his approval. That night after the last customer left and Clara began stacking chairs, the bell above the door jingled again. She frowned. A sleek midnight blue car idled outside, and from it stepped Julian Westmont. He looked almost too sharp for the soft glow of the cafe, like a figure cut from stone stepping into a watercolor painting, his eyes locked onto hers. "I have a proposition," he said. Clara gave a tired smirk. "If it's about coffee, we're closed." He returned the smirk. "It's not about coffee. I need you to pretend to be my wife." Silence fell like snow. At what Clara blinked, nearly dropping the tray in her hands. "I need a fake wife," Julian said, his tone calm but resolute. "My mother insists I settle down. I don't want a real marriage. You play the role. 1 year after that, you're free and well compensated." She laughed dry and disbelieving. "Do I look like an actress to you?" "No," he said. "You look like someone who needs a break, maybe a fresh start." And that was the worst part. He wasn't wrong. Clara's chest tightened. Rent debt. The quiet grief of a life put on hold, she stared into his unreadable gaze. Behind it, she didn't see romance, but she saw a door. Maybe not to love, but to survival. Maybe something more. After a long pause, she took a breath. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." 1 week later. Clara Monroe walked into a world that didn't feel real. Julian's estate was perched in an exclusive corner of Montclair Heights, a place where even the trees looked expensive. The mansion itself was all glass steel and impossible angles, every surface gleaming like it had never known dust. It was stunning and cold. No family photos, no clutter, no warmth. Julian was a man of precision, and every square inch of his home reflected it. Clara felt like an ink stain on white marble. The next morning, she padded barefoot into the sleek, polished kitchen, wearing an old, oversized t-shirt that hung halfway to her knees. Her hair was still damp from the shower, and she hummed a tune softly as she opened the fridge. What do you think you're doing?" The voice came from behind her, low, sharp, and ice-cold. She turned slowly to find Julian standing in the doorway, dressed impeccably in a dark suit. Despite the early hour, his expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw was impossible to miss. Clara blinked. "I'm getting breakfast," she said, holding up a carton of orange juice. Julian folded his arms. "This isn't a hostel." And just like that, the war had begun. Julian Westmont stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, arms folded across his chest, dressed sharply in a navy suit, the kind meant for intimidating boardrooms, not quiet mornings. His presence was as cold as the marble floors beneath Clara's bare feet. She looked up from the refrigerator, a carton of almond milk in her hands, and quirked a brow, looking for something to eat. "Isn't this technically our house now?" Julian stepped forward and pulled open the fridge door with the precision of a man rearranging chess pieces. "You've moved everything." Clara blinked. "I took out milk and bread. That's not exactly a renovation." Julian exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose like a man negotiating with fate itself. "I like everything in its place," he said flatly. "If you're going to live here, you'll need to follow the rules." Clara leaned against the counter, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "Your rules, I assume?" "Exactly." "Well, Mr. Control Freak," she said sweetly, "I'll try not to ruin the symmetry of your jam jars." Julian frowned but said nothing. Instead, he poured himself a perfectly measured cup of black coffee, turned on his heel, and left his exit as dramatic as his entrance. Clara stared after him, shaking her head. This was going to be harder than she thought. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't let Julian Westmont dictate her every move. Not in her own story. 2 days later, Clara's quiet rebellion was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a storm in high heels. Eleanor Westmont. Julian's mother swept into the mansion like she was conducting an inspection, her heels clicking against the polished floor, eyes sharp as razors. She paused when she saw Clara. "My dear." "You look radiant," Margot said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Married life must be treating you well." Clara mirrored the smile, doing her best impression of a woman madly in love. "Oh, it's been unforgettable." Julian stood beside her, his posture tense. He studied Clara out of the corner of his eye, clearly assessing how well she'd play her part. Margot tilted her head, her gaze narrowing. "So have you two settled into domestic bliss yet?" Clara's pulse quickened. One wrong pause and the charade would crack. Then without warning, Julian slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Of course we have," he said smoothly. "Clara's been a wonderful wife." Clara froze. His touch was warm, steady, real. For a split second, her brain forgot the script. But as his hand gave her waist a subtle squeeze, she realized he was nudging her, a silent reminder, play along. Margot watched them for a long beat. Then finally, she smiled. "Good. I can't wait to see you both at your anniversary celebration." Clara barely managed to keep her composure as Margot made her exit. The moment the door closed, she stepped back from Julian and shot him a glare. "What the hell was that?" Julian gave an indifferent shrug. "Just doing my part, you're welcome." Her heart was still thudding louder than it should, but she reminded herself this wasn't real. Just lines in a play. A week later, Clara was descending the staircase, arms full of Julian's business files she'd agreed to help organize. Her socks slipped on the polished wood. The world tilted. She gasped and braced for pain, but instead of the floor, she fell into arms. Strong, steady. Julian. He caught her one hand behind her back, the other gripping her arm firmly. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. His face was inches from hers, breath warm against her cheek, his storm-gray eyes locked onto hers, and Clara's pulse went wild. Why did she feel breathless? Why didn't he let go? Finally. Julian spoke, his voice lower than usual. "You should be more careful." But still he didn't move, as if his own body had betrayed him, as if something in him didn't want to let go. and for a single suspended second, neither did she. Clara stepped away quickly, brushing off the invisible tremble still clinging to her skin. "Noted, thanks," she muttered, doing her best to sound unaffected. But even as she walked down the hallway, her heart continued its quiet rebellion, thumping harder than it should. She told herself it was nothing. Just adrenaline. Just proximity. But Julian Westmont had started to change. She'd noticed it in the smallest ways, in the way he no longer scolded her when she forgot to close the cupboard or when she rearranged his sterile kitchen shelves in search of comfort. Once, when she called him in frustration after getting lost on her way to the local market, she braced for a lecture. But instead, he simply sighed and showed up. 15 minutes later, handing her a water bottle and telling her to breathe first. It didn't make sense. Not until that night, the night she fell sick. Clara had barely been able to stand, her body burning with fever. But when she opened her eyes, groggy and weak, she saw him, Julian Westmont, sitting by her bed, a cool cloth in one hand, medicine in the other. He didn't say much. He just stayed. He sat with her through the night, adjusting the compress on her forehead, whispering gentle instructions, when she stirred, and at some point when exhaustion claimed them both. He fell asleep, his hand still wrapped around hers. She woke up in the soft blue light of dawn, his fingers still holding on, and her heart didn't just skip, it flipped. Was this still just a transaction? Or had something shifted? Julian had built his life on precision and logic. Feelings were like loose wires in a control panel. They didn't belong. But lately Clara had become the glitch in his system. He told himself it was all part of the agreement. He was just making sure she played her role convincingly. But that lie unraveled the moment he saw her at the Caldwell Foundation gala. She was radiant, and she wasn't looking at him. Clara was across the room laughing. Really. Laughing with a young investment broker whose name Julian didn't care to remember. The man was charming, quick with compliments, and entirely too close. Jealousy hit Julian like a fist. Before he knew it, he was walking no storming across the ballroom. "Clara," he said sharply. She turned, startled, blinking up at him. "Julian." Without asking, he slid an arm around her waist and turned to the broker, his voice cool as steel. "Thanks for entertaining my wife, but I'll be taking it from here." The broker gave a polite nod. Clara, however, looked anything but pleased. When they were alone again, she pulled back slightly, frowning Julian. What the hell was that? He should have had an answer, should have told her it was for show. But for once his mind was quiet, and not in a good way. He didn't know if what he'd done was for the contract, or because he simply couldn't stand the thought of losing her. From that night on, Clara noticed him differently. He began paying attention to the tiniest things, how she always stirred her coffee after adding sugar, how she picked out onions with surgical precision, how she read before bed like it was oxygen. And one rainy afternoon, after an especially grueling shift, Clara came home and found a small white box waiting on the kitchen island inside strawberry tarts. Her favorite. She blinked in disbelief, then turned to find Julian lounging on the sofa, a document in hand reading, as if he hadn't just shattered her expectations of him. She held up the box. "Did you get these?" Without looking up, he replied. "Yes." She folded her arms. "Why?" This time, he did look up, and in his storm-gray eyes, there was no sarcasm, no coldness, just something startlingly real, because you like them. Clara's breath caught as she stared at the dessert box in silence. She didn't know how to respond, not with words at least, so instead, she opened the lid, picked up a tart, and took a bite. The sweetness of the strawberries burst on her tongue, and in that quiet moment, one truth unfolded in her heart. Julian Westmont, the cold, calculated man she had agreed to marry for appearances, wasn't just a role in her life anymore. Slowly, dangerously, he was becoming something real. 1 month later, The West Corporation's annual gala shimmered with chandeliers, champagne, and secrets. Clara, dressed in a pale silver gown, moved through the elegant crowd beside Julian, her hand gently resting on his arm. Eleanor Westmont made her arrival with the regal air of a queen, her sharp eyes scanning every smile, every glance. Clara knew that look. It was the same one a hawk gave before it struck. She had never quite trusted this marriage, and tonight she was clearly looking for cracks in their story. Everything was going smoothly until a longtime family associate approached them with a curious smile. "You two certainly look the part," the man said, swirling his wine. "But forgive me, I don't think I've ever seen you kiss your lovely wife in public." Julian, surely that's not asking too much from a happily married couple. Clara froze. Julian did too. Around them, conversation slowed. The murmurs of the room dulled as eyes began to shift toward them, and Clara felt the full weight of Margot's gaze pinning her in place. Julian gently squeezed her hand. "You don't mind, do you?" Before she could respond, he leaned in slow, deliberate. His lips met hers. It was meant to be convincing, nothing more. But the second their lips touched, something shifted. His kiss wasn't cold or calculated. It was warm, grounding, possessive in a way that made her knees weaken. Clara's eyes fluttered closed as her hands instinctively clutched the lapels of his suit, and when he finally pulled away, the room broke into applause. But Clara didn't hear a thing. Her world had narrowed to the man in front of her and the thunder in her chest. After that night, the game no longer felt like a game. Clara started avoiding. Julian, terrified of how real everything felt. She reminded herself, over and over, this was a contract, a role, an arrangement with an expiration date. But Julian didn't seem to share her hesitation. He drew closer. He asked how her day had been, sat with her in the library while she read, ordered her favorite meals, brought her hot tea when she had headaches. He was doing everything a real husband might do, and her heart. It stopped pretending. But love never blossoms without trials. Clara was descending the stairs one evening when a voice light, teasing and unmistakably feminine, drifted from the living room. "Julian, I missed you." Clara stopped in her tracks. At the base of the stairs stood a woman with golden hair, ocean blue eyes, and the confidence of someone who once belonged. She was stunning, and she was standing far too close to Julian Clare. Julian said, his tone instantly cool. His arms were folded, his body rigid. "What are you doing here? I heard you got married." Claire tilted her head, a mocking smirk playing on her lips. "You?" The man who swore love was just a business illusion. Married, Clara gripped the railing tighter. "This has nothing to do with you," Julian said. "Oh, I think it does," Claire purred, stepping forward and placing a hand on his chest. "Do you love her, Julian? Or is she just another chess piece in your perfect little empire?" Clara didn't wait to hear the answer. She turned, walked away, and behind her, Claire's soft chuckle echoed like a crack in glass. "If it's just pretend, why are you playing the part so well?" She hadn't changed. Standing in that modest doorway, she was still the Clara he had fallen for, just as radiant, just as real. But now there was something different in her eyes, a wariness born of heartbreak. Julian took a breath, his voice low but steady. "I'm not here because of the contract." Clara blinked her brows, knitting slightly in confusion. He stepped closer, his tone firmer now. "This has nothing to do with my mother, nothing to do with appearances. I'm here because I love you." Clara's lips parted, her voice trembling as she replied, "Julian, you don't have to do this. The deal is over. There are no obligations left between us." Julian reached for her hand, warm, familiar, trembling, just like his own. "I'm not doing this out of obligation," he whispered. "I'm doing it because I've tried living without you, and I can't." His eyes searched hers, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. Then with a deep breath, he said the words that shattered every last wall between them. If I have to give up my company, my legacy, everything I've built, I will. If it means I get to wake up next to you every morning, I'll let it all go. A soft gasp escaped Clara's lips, followed by a sob that she could no longer hold back. Her tears spilled not from pain, but from something far deeper, the overwhelming realization that this man truly loved her. No pretense, no deal. Julian gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "Come home with me," he whispered. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. In that instant, they both knew what began, as a contract had become something real, something unbreakable. Love in its truest form had finally found them. Several months later, the grand halls of the Westmont estate echoed with music, laughter, and soft candlelight. A wedding was about to begin, not one born of convenience, but of choice. Clara stood before a tall mirror draped in silk and lace, her reflection barely recognizable to her. The door creaked open. It was Eleanor Westmont, Julian's mother, the woman who had once orchestrated the marriage that changed both their lives. She stepped forward, her voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "You've changed him," she said, taking Clara's hands. "He smiles more, he laughs. You brought life into his world again." Clara lowered her eyes. I'm not sure I'm enough." Eleanor chuckled gently. "You're not just enough, my dear, you're the only one who could reach his heart." The music began. As Clara walked down the aisle, her gaze met Julian's steady, unwavering, filled with all the promises she'd ever dreamed of. No masks, no contracts, just love. When he took her hand, it was no longer to fulfill a deal. It was to begin forever. They spoke their vows, not as actors in a script, but as two hearts that had weathered storms to find their way to each other. And when Julian kissed her, it wasn't a performance. It was home. They started as strangers bound by a contract. But in the end, they found something far more powerful, a love that healed, challenged, and transformed them. Julian Westmont didn't just find a partner in Clara. He found the one person who saw beyond his walls, who reminded him that love isn't weakness, it's strength, and Clara. She discovered that even a heart scarred by disappointment can bloom again when it's held in the right hands. No more conditions, no more pretending. Just two souls choosing each other freely, completely, forever. Because real love doesn't follow rules, it writes its own story. Thank you for being here, and for letting this story touch your heart. If it made you smile, cry, or simply believe in love again, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in love.